Hello and good evening to all those who are joining in from India, and good morning to those of you joining in from the United States. I'm Aparna Pande, Director of the India Initiative at Hudson Institute, and I welcome all of you on behalf of Hudson Institute and Takshashila Institution. Before we begin, a bit about the two think tanks for those who are new here today. Hudson Institute was founded in 1961 by strategist Herman Kahn. Hudson is focused on helping to manage strategic transitions to the future through studies in defense, international relations, economics, healthcare, technology, culture, and law. Our collaborator, Takshashila, is an independent center for research and education in public policy. Takshashila is a non-partisan think tank and is concerned with how India shapes the world and how the world shapes India in turn. This is the sixth and final webinar in our six-part discussion series, The China Challenge. Our aim in these conversations has been to answer one question: how can India and the United States respond to China's increasing assertiveness and growing global ambitions? The format we are using for these conversations is what we call a deep webinar. These are thoughtfully curated conversations that bring together great panelists with discussants from diverse backgrounds. We also like to see audience participation, so please feel free to pose your questions in the Q&A feature. The focus of today's panel is countering Beijing's military might. And we are fortunate to have with us today two excellent speakers. General Prakash Menon is Director of the Strategic Studies Program at Takshashila Institution. He's also Professor Emeritus at Transdisciplinary University at Bangalore and Adjunct Professor, National Institute of Advanced Studies, Bangalore. General Menon had a 3-decade-long career in the Indian Army and after retirement served on the National Security Council Secretariat. Bryan Clark is my colleague and senior fellow at Hudson Institute. He's director of the Center for Defense Concepts and Technology and an expert in naval operations, electronic warfare, autonomous systems, military competitions, and wargaming. Bryan served in the naval headquarters and was special assistant to the Chief of Naval Operations. Warm welcome to both General Menon and Bryan. Joining them are our three discussants. Shibani Mehta is research analyst at the Security Studies Program at Carnegie, India. She was previously associated with the Strategic Studies Program at Takshashila. Dinakar Perry is defense correspondent at The Hindu. Prior to journalism, he was an associate fellow at the Center for Law Warfare Studies. Yusuf Unjwala is editor at Defense Forum, India, and commentator on defense and strategic affairs. General Menon, I will start by asking you how Delhi views China's rise, from new theater commands to new doctrines, from expanding naval and nuclear forces to new technologies. The PLA has changed unrecognizably over the last 2 decades. India, on the other hand, is still far from completing the modernization process promised almost 2 decades ago. Can India modernize its armed forces quickly enough to meet the military challenge from China?
Thank you, Aparna, and good evening to all our viewers. I'm grateful to Takshashila Institution for this opportunity to giving a general a mic. And it is a place where I feel constantly intellectually simulated cerebral condition. So I must thank them for what they have done to me at this stage in my life. And I must thank Hudson for this interaction. Today is 2nd of October, it's Gandhi Jayanti, the father of our nation, the apostle of peace and non-violence. And it is ironic that we discuss military power, which has at its center and core the use of violence for political purposes. Violence that is aimed to either threaten or cause destruction, death, injury, so on. I presume that the existing geopolitical conditions really warrant as to what is the role of military power in the changes that we see. And I think the question which Aparna poses to me strikes at the heart of this issue. So to say, what is Delhi's view? I must say that, Takshashila prides itself from being at a standoff distance from Delhi. And therefore, what I say may not necessarily be Delhi's views, because Delhi has its own views, it's got a plethora of views, and what it has about Beijing's views is what Delhi's views is not known to us. So this is an independent view of how Takshashila looks as to answer that question, the first part of the question. How does it view China's military rise? Impressive. Its sheer speed, scope, and scale is definitely unprecedented. I remember in 2007, I was a major general. I was head of operations of Northern Command. I attended the first hand-in-hand exercise in Kunming. And when I came back after interaction with them, I was not very impressed with the Chinese military in an overall sense. That was my impression after I had interacted with them, especially the idea of the political commissar system. And I don't know how it works in combat and so on. I came back with a little bit of skepticism about China's military rise. I'm no longer of that view, obviously, as the rest of the world is. But how we see it is China's military rise is definitely impressive in terms of absolute military power, especially if you do the material counting in terms of all those equipment which are photogenic and which can convey to the adversary the idea of strength. And China actually does this very openly. It does no longer conceal what it has. Its aircraft carrier, newly equipped, shown to the world as if it's already been operationalized. It's been there. And if you ask any person who's been in the Navy before, who's operated off an aircraft carrier, it takes a long time for that to happen. But that, I think the point we have to understand is, here is China telling the world that we are big, we are strong, we are militarily strong. Now you better listen to what we tell you. It is seeking obedience, especially in Asia. And India obviously comes within that repertoire. It's managed to convince, probably to a large extent, all the small guys. But I think we must understand that China's military power in absolute sense when compared to India is definitely very impressive. But military power especially is a relational variable. China cannot be as strong in the Indian Ocean as it can be in South China Sea. The simple reason of geography, distances, bases, and so on, and India's positioning in that ocean. It's also the case that China cannot bring its entire military power to be applied against India because it's got far more problems, especially off its eastern seaboard, starting from Japan to Taiwan to the South China Sea and the United States of America. So Indians do not think that the Chinese have become so big that we just have to actually now start listening or capitulate. We think that the Chinese, if you look at the way that they have used force, that their main design of use of force is about doing the small thing under the radar, small enough, not for too much of a retaliation, but small enough, never the same, and then threatening the big stuff to get something done. So the military instrument has to be viewed in its political context. And in Sino-Indian context, the use of that military instrument is about influencing India's strategic behavior. What that means, probably we'll come to it a little later, but in military terms, China is using especially our vulnerabilities on the northern border to convey political messages off and on, and it's been doing that for quite some time, as Aparna mentioned. And it is this messaging which India has to take into account and deal with the situation accordingly. So what we find is that on the northern border, we can hold our own. We are both nuclear powers. The idea of a big fight, that the Chinese will bring 44 divisions across the Himalayan mountain range and come into the plains of India, is just a military imagination. It's military fiction. It's about an understanding of people who have not tried to supply a modern army across the mighty Himalayas. And let me tell you, it is not an easy job. But it's military fiction, nevertheless, used for political purposes because it can be threatened. We are not taken in by such threats. We are obviously got a lot of vulnerabilities. And the main style which China has indulged is salami slicing, which means that it goes and sits and occupies unoccupied spaces in a situation where there is an agreement for movement to take place, but that is supposed to be temporary movement for patrolling. So in violation of these agreements is what China has done. It has not attacked an Indian post. And whatever happened in Galwan is probably a clash which is unplanned for. But the fact remains that China's use of force, whether it will step up and increase the scale of that force, especially since Xi Jinping is now in complete control of the Chinese military. I think it is unprecedented the way that he has resolved or sorted out many of these Chinese generals in the CMC. Whether he will use force more than ever China has done in modern times. As an Indian and as a military planner, we can rule nothing out. But we, I think, have the confidence to actually stand and hold our own. Because in the big fight, the vulnerabilities which China has, especially in the maritime domain, is something which it will find it very difficult to sort of resolve and close. So if I want to look at Chinese military power, I'm impressed, but I'm not convinced that it can use that power to coerce India. And whether we will be quick enough to ask the second part of the question, to actually be able to counter China's military rise, that's a question which is difficult to answer, because anybody who looks at Indians' defense preparations will always find that we are underperforming, and we continue to do so. But the idea that military power rests in these photogenic weapon systems only is ignorant of the strength of geography, of resolve, of interests, of the intangibles which finally make the difference. Great idea which China has solved, as put it out about comprehensive national power, and they are the strongest, must be taken with a pinch of salt. So I would actually stop here and hand over the mic back to Aparna.
Thank you, General. I'll come back to some of the things you said, but let me actually bring in Bryan, because I'd like to bring in the American perspective. Bryan, I'll turn to you. Since the end of the Second World War, the US policy has traditionally been a liberal international order and American preeminence, especially in Asia. China seeks to upend that and create, let's say, a Chinese-led order. There are those who say the US was slow to recognize the Chinese challenge. Was the US military slow to recognize it? Yes or no? And sort of, is it still, I don't think it is any longer slow to recognize China's military rise, but how would you look at China's military rise, especially in Asia, from the American perspective?
Thank you, Aparna, and I'm really pleased to be here. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you to the Takshashila organization for inviting me to be here today. It's a great opportunity for me, and I really enjoyed General Menon's remarks. I agree with a lot of what he said. I think in terms of the American response to the rise of China, I agree with you, Aparna, that the military may not have been slow to recognize the growing military power that was being developed by China through its modernization programs. But aside from some experts in the US military that were focused on the China challenge, a lot of folks in the US government wanted to push back on those concerns in the hopes that better relations with China would help on economic and diplomatic fronts, in particular with some of the work that the Obama administration was pursuing in trying to isolate Iran and get the Iranian nuclear agreement, the JCPOA, established. And in the work they were doing with regard to North Korea and trying to isolate North Korea and reduce its threat to both the region and to the United States by extension. I think there was a hope that this more transactional approach, where we sort of turned away from or turned a blind eye to some of the military modernization and hope that we could deal with China on economic and diplomatic terms, started to fade away in the late Obama administration. When some of the political leaders recognized that transaction was not working, and that China was not really supporting us on some of the diplomatic and financial and economic fronts, but at the same time was continuing the modernization efforts that were going to threaten US allies and partners that are in the area around China. So you saw in the late Obama administration a move to try to establish a little bit more deliberate strategy to militarily address the China modernization effort and its rise. And that was carried on and intensified during the Trump administration. So, and you could see some of the players involved. I think, the Congress in the US recognized or was taking action earlier in terms of driving the DoD to be more open and transparent about what China was doing, through the China military power reports that the Congress demanded. You could see within the think tank world, think tanks were pushing DoD and the White House to be a little bit more aggressive with regard to China. So that started to play out now, and you now see a full recognition of the threat that China poses militarily coming from the entire US government. But I would say what's happened, though, is there's been a failure to exploit the opportunities that have been presented to the US government and really drive those into a coherent strategy. And so, for example, you saw the trade war, the trade confrontations that have occurred between the US and China since the Trump administration came into office. Those have been very, sort of ham-handed and not really focused on, maybe the best markets that would be giving us the best leverage. It was more focused on domestic constituencies here in the United States. But those trade, offensives could have been an element of a coherent strategy that helped to push China back in the areas they were pursuing militarily. So, for example, island building in the South China Sea, its aggressive behavior towards U.S. allies like Japan and the Philippines. The U.S. didn't try to make that part of the overall strategy to say these trade tariffs, these trade actions are being taken in part to make you back down on these other aggressive actions you're taking. So the U.S. didn't mount a coherent, whole of government strategy in an effort to contain China's military rise. And you see now with another example is the recent semiconductor or technology related export controls the U.S. has put in place that relate to Huawei. Again, those actions are really intended to maybe protect U.S. networks and protect U.S. industry, but in fact could be a really strong element of a overall effort to contain China militarily. You could say these actions are going to stay in place until you start to moderate your behavior militarily when it comes to the South China Sea and the East China Sea, for example. So you're seeing there's a recognition and a desire to do something about China, but the government has failed to really mount a coherent strategy that takes advantage of the opportunities and the levers that are available to the United States. And you see a focus in the U.S. military on just trying to symmetrically, deal with China, as opposed to the whole government being able to mount a more consolidated approach. And then when it comes to the military competition, I think there's been a pretty strong recognition, and the most recent China military power report that came out of the United States, the DoD, was very good at describing the challenge, what it was that China was attempting to do strategically. I think in some ways, though, it mischaracterized or didn't fully characterize the nature of China's modernization. As General Menon brought up, China is still very focused on trying to consolidate its near seas and its near abroad. So it's still focused its military capabilities on those efforts, which means its ability to project power further away has been somewhat retarded in relation to its efforts to do local sea control and local air control, which gives, again, opportunities for the US and India to pressure China, because they have not been able to invest in power projection to the degree that the Chinese government may hope to do in the future. So there's opportunities there that could be exploited. And then I would say the last thing is, as the general brought up, China is facing multiple threats or challenges on multiple axes, and doesn't have the freedom to focus all of its attention on Japan or on India, for example. And so even though militarily they've modernized, they've grown, they're doing a lot of reformation within their military and government, they still have multiple challenges facing them in different parts of their region, and they're going to have to contend with. And so, for example, you see today, day to day, there's only 9 or so Chinese ships, PLA ships, operating in the Indian Ocean, even though their fleet is 300 and some ships. Partly that's because those ships, their whole fleet is not designed for power projection or going abroad, doing transoceanic transits. And it's also because they have other things they have to use those ships to do, which involve pressuring their neighbors to give in on territorial claims, continue to show the flag in the Western Pacific to counter the impression that the U.S. is the predominant naval power. So you can see these pressures that the general raised playing out in terms of their posture and force deployment. So the Chinese military modernization needs to be taken with a grain of salt, both in terms of its ability to really be put into effect in a conflict, as the general mentioned, and also just because it's spread out over multiple challenges, and it's not necessarily suited well to address all of those challenges. And so that puts the Chinese in a position of having to sort of bide their time a little bit still before they can go and try to influence events overseas the way that the U.S. has done over the last century or so. So I'll turn it back over to you at that point. Thank you.
Thanks, Bryan. I'll come back to something you said, but I'd I'd like to come back to General Menon first. General Menon, you spoke about you looked at how the India, China, and China's military rise. I'd like to broaden out and look at the South Asia and the Indian Ocean region. China has built over the years economic, military, actually in some places nuclear and intelligence ties with India's neighbors. Pakistan is a key ally of China, but there's a close relationship with Sri Lanka, with Nepal, even Bangladesh. And India has concerns. I mean, from Djibouti to Gwadar and Hambantota, there are those who call it string of pearls strategy. There are those who say it is BRI with the dual use infrastructure. How do you view what China has done in India's immediate neighborhood? And what are India's, I would say, options to maybe not maybe counter what China is doing, and should India be concerned about China being so deeply integrated in the neighborhood?
Yes, of course. The question to ask is, why is China doing it? Why is China interested in the subcontinent and the Indian Ocean? And I think that answer for all of us is very clear. First is to confine India into the subcontinent. It has used Pakistan for a very long time for that purpose. It is now using in greater measure the northern border to actually keep us engaged there. Because the greater concern for China is about what geography has bestowed to India India's peninsula jutting out as a knife into the Indian Ocean. And that's a matter of concern. And that is why China seeks to influence any country which it can, and it has the wherewithal to do it. And unlike military power, it can buy, which it does, through debt diplomacy mostly. And that's how it's been able to actually get into most of these countries using its economic power. And also the fact that after all our neighbors would like to benefit from both sides. So they play the game accordingly. So we understand that. But we also understand that, except of course, Pakistan belongs to a different basket altogether. All the other countries have got a certain level of relations with India, which they cannot really, will not easily like to actually weaken, because it will have certain costs. And I think therefore, if you look at what India is, how it's dealing with its neighbors, and it goes up and down, and now the most problematic and new guy on the scene on the Chinese stage is Nepal, with Oli in charge. But we don't take it as a given and something which we cannot roll back. So I think we have the capacity to at least ensure what is our most, what he called, dangerous threat, that the Chinese use these as bases against us. That is a red line. And I think in many ways it would have been conveyed to all these countries. And I don't think any country would possibly be interested in actually letting that happen, because bases can be military base, would involve not only military infrastructure, it would also have a communication, eavesdropping, a whole lot of things which can be there. But I think we have the capacity to know when that happens, so we can't easily be cheated on it. So that's one point. The second point is about the basis which it seeks in terms of supporting its naval capability. Well, let's be very clear that the Chinese mainland is located quite far from the Indian Ocean. It requires these bases to be effective in maritime terms. And that capability will always be judged by the ability to actually have these bases which can cater for your ammunition, which is logistics, maintenance, repair. All these modern vessels are high maintenance stuff. You can't just put them into the Indian Ocean and actually allow them to be there for a long time. So the restrictive number of bases it can do in the next 10 years. And Hambantota, I think we should be very clear, the people put it in the same category as Gwadar and Djibouti. I don't think Hambantota is in that category, for the simple reason that India is very clear it will not make that happen. And I don't think the Sri Lankans really have any idea of making it happen. Even Djibouti. Djibouti, after all, is a very interesting place because there are a lot of nations actually having their bases there. So if push comes to shove, as you Americans call it, I don't see the Americans letting the Chinese move out from that base. I mean, by any stretch of imagination. And Gwadar, being a singular base, it will not be easy to tackle. So the idea that China is, of course, stretching itself, and it will try to continue to do so. We understand why it is doing so. But I think we have the wherewithal to actually counter that. And overall, what it tells us is that India international cooperation lies in the realm of the maritime domain. We know for certain that nobody is going to come and fight for us in the northern border. We are very clear. Yeah, we need the wherewithal, and that's why when you see these Chinooks, which has been shown very often on Indian TV, it sort of signifies American presence in the Himalayas. And there is more to it than just the Chinooks, let me tell you that. There's the C-130s, the C-17s, they're all there. So But the real cooperation, and that I think is a realization which the Indian political leadership and its military leadership is very aware of, is in the domain of the maritime. Because the fact that we need to at least cooperate to make sure that this guy who says and wants to bully everybody in sight has to be shown its place can only be done through cooperation. India nor United States should even try to do it alone for all that measure. So I think there is a very strong case here for actually deepening the cooperation. How that cooperation spans out, in what manner you want to call it, in what name you want to give it, what label that you want to do, whether you don't want to outrightly say that this is not against China, and everybody knows that it is. It's international hypocrisy, which everybody knows. So the fact is, that's diplomacy, and I'm sure the diplomats will always find a way around it. So I think what the present situation especially has triggered is a greater sense within India itself that we can no longer actually sit in comfort and expect that others will do their job, we will do ours, and everything we together. I think there is a heightened sense that we need to cooperate, and I think there is a lot of common interests involved here. And I think I sense the larger shift, not only even in the public, but I think in all levels of leadership. We might argue whether it is, what do we want to call these relationships? And I think the strategic partnership label has enough flexibility for us to actually do things together and yet not be seen to be the same, because we need to maintain a separateness. And I always described it that we need to actually expand the tents in which we sit with our friends. We don't have to be in anybody. We don't have to pitch the tent in a camp, but we can sit in many tents. So I think we are concerned. And of course, we know what the realities are. But as far as the maritime space is concerned, and even the subcontinent is concerned, we need deepened cooperation. That there is no doubt. Thank you, Aparna.
Thank you, General Menon. This is a great segue to Bryan, since Bryan's area and focus is the maritime. So Bryan, I'm going to put you on the spot. And my question to you is, the US has sort of, over the years built a sort of, let's say, many countries in the world did free riding on the American Navy, because the American naval and maritime presence ensured that everybody else could go about their business and not have to worry. China has been building a counter maritime presence, but as General Menon said, and you also mentioned earlier, sort of it may look impressive, it is not sort of, all as impressive as the American presence was. So the American alliance system has come under pressure in the last few years, both internal and external. But considering the rise of China and the US military response, is the American alliance system or partnership system, since Indians prefer to call it a partnership, not an alliance, is it strong enough? And sort of, for sort of to counter China? And here I would ask you to talk a little bit about India-US relationship vis-a-vis China. I mean, what are India and US doing in the maritime domain, and what maybe would you like us to do more?
Yes, thanks, Aparna. That's a great question. So I would say that to go back to the initial part of your question is, clearly the maritime domain is an area where a lot of this cooperation can occur, like the general was saying. I think that the US and India have been doing more exercises of late. So Malabar has been a series of exercises that the US has done with India for the last, I think, 15 years now. And the complexity and sophistication of Malabar is improving over that time. We've had over the last few years multi-carrier exercises as part of Malabar. We've had relatively large forces being brought together to conduct exercises there. There's multiple smaller exercises that happen on a regular basis between the US and Indian naval forces. We also have the Quad emerging, kind of re-emerging as a force for bringing together Japanese, Australian, US, and Indian naval forces. The Quad obviously has a set of ministerial level engagements, but there's also an element of it that has to do with maritime cooperation. And we're seeing more opportunities for maritime cooperation between those four countries, particularly in support of the idea of a free and open Indo-Pacific, which Japan obviously pushed that idea initially. The US got on board of it. Now Australia is on board with it. I think the Quad is now kind of come around to that idea as being at least a central theme for the cooperation between the four countries. The reason that cooperation is important is you've got all four countries have navies that are designed to operate in kind of the open ocean environment that that exemplifies the Indian Ocean. So the Indian Ocean, although it has littorals, it's not the same kind of littoral environment as you see in the East and South China Seas. The PLAN Navy is not, as I said, optimized for that open ocean environment. If you look at the PLA Navy's construct, it's got 300 or so ships, but of that 300 or so ships, about 200 or more than 200 are actually designed more for that littoral environment. They have relatively small missile magazines. They're designed to operate more or less under the protection of mainland-based air defenses and surface-to-surface missiles. So the expectation of the PLAN is normally when they're operating, they may have to do some self-protection of their individual ships, but if they're beset upon by a larger force, they're going to have a bunch of mainland-based aircraft and missiles that can go take out that opposing naval force. They're not designed to then operate independently in a place like the Indian Ocean where they're the away team and they're going to face other away teams that are able to bring much more forces to bear than the Chinese Navy would be able to defend against. So the Quad and the Indian and American navies in particular, can bring forces out that are more designed for long endurance operations, power projection operations, have lots of offensive capability even though the Chinese Navy is modernized substantially, they're not really designed to really address that level of threat. They're designed to operate in the near seas, the East and South China Sea. So if you look at their force design, they've got a couple of carriers. They've got a few of these larger cruisers that are really designed for open ocean operations. And then they've got a dozen or so of the newest destroyers that can do that. And then aside from that, their missile magazines are too small to support self-defense and offensive operations. And the ships themselves lack some of the endurance you would need to be able to operate transoceanically and over a sustained period of time. So that's an area of opportunity for the allies and the Quad, and I think in the Indian Ocean. So maritime cooperation will be a key element of that. Yeah, I would say that the Indian naval modernization, it really does play into that because it's focusing, not on littoral ships per se, but it's focused on aircraft carriers, submarines, larger surface combatants that are going to be necessary to compete with China, where you can get, as the general mentioned, a more symmetrical competition because the Chinese just can't maintain a force that's large enough in the Indian Ocean to overwhelm the Indian Navy. So there's an opportunity there for India to be able to press its influence and curtail the ability of the Chinese to exploit the bases or the dual use facilities that they've developed as part of the Belt and Road Initiative throughout the Indian Ocean littoral. So those bases are somewhat vulnerable, and if they can't be defended with naval forces, they themselves might become a liability rather than an asset. So I think there are opportunities there, and that the navies have been ramping that up. It seems like at the top level, so there's been a lot of from the senior level at the Trump administration, there's been a lot of undermining of alliances, primarily in Europe, focused on the everybody spending enough on defense and towing the line or carrying their weight. That's been much less the case in Asia, where the perception has been that those allies and partners are pulling their weight and investing significantly in their own defense. So there's been, I guess, a much stronger relationship at the top. And I think in both cases, at the mid-level and junior level, the relationships have continued more or less unabated, with the Trump administration coming into office. So my peers, at the 1 and 2 star level or the senior captain level, they're all continuing their engagements as if really nothing's changed back in Washington. So
thank you so much. Thank you so much, Bryan. I'd now like to bring in our discussants. I'll ask Shivani Mehta to ask her question or comment, both of you.
Thank you, Dr. Pande, and I would also like to thank the organizers for having me. I think both the gentlemen did helped me out a lot by laying out all the options that both the US and India have when it comes to challenging China. I would like to stay with the maritime security domain that both of you have spoken about and have clearly said that there are vulnerabilities that China has in maritime security which can be utilized to challenge rise of China. So how do you see, I mean, you've clearly said that the US-India strategic cooperation should deepen as we go ahead. But what are the other partnerships that both India and the US should be paying more attention to? Is there something that is being overlooked and that should be brought to the forefront and pursued more aggressively? So yeah, that is my question.
Well, I can start there if you'd like, Aparna. So clearly the Quad is an opportunity that they're both pursuing. So I think that's well recognized. There are opportunities to further the cooperation of the U.S. and India in Eastern Africa. I think one thing that is somewhat times overlooked is the extensive Chinese investment in East Africa. Through places like Lamu, Bagamoyo, throughout those countries, they're investing in port infrastructure, they're investing in the government, they're getting behind somewhat corrupt leaders in an effort to get access to that littoral environment and get a place where they can start basing forces, as well as being able to come in for repair and reconstitution. So I think there's an untapped opportunity there, both for China, for India and the United States to counter China, especially given India's longstanding relationships in Africa that are not necessarily shared by the United States. But that's, I think, one opportunity that often gets overlooked.
General Menon, would you like to?
Yeah. So the scope is determined by the issue of how much deepen the political relations develop. And I think at this point in time, I'm not quite sure whether we can make a judgment and how much it will change depending upon how the US elects and who it elects as its president. So I take that whatever happens there will not affect fundamentally our relationship. And I think that could be the case. But I think there's always scope for more. It is a question of exploration. And especially in the military arena, we've been at it for quite some time. We've been working together, trying to understand each other. I think greater scope is of getting more actors onto the stage of cooperation. And that is the increase the numbers which are there now, not just contained to a few. So I think we need to widen, incorporate more. And I think that would be the greatest, I would say, mechanism which you will develop in terms of strength. And it is possible because there are common interests. And that's very clear to everybody, what those interests are. And even if a country has reservations, that it does not want to be seen to be acting against China, I think that particular point has been that we have crossed that turning, or we just turned there in international relations because of China's continuous assertive and aggressive behavior across the landscape of Asia. And I think there is scope there for reluctance to now be changed or to be modified and to achieve greater sense of cooperation. And I think that the issue really is who will take the lead? Who will be the main actors? How will they play it? Will they act as the big boss and tell everybody this is how we're going to do it? or is it going to have a cooperative framework which takes a view which is consensual, takes a part? Can America play that role? I mean, after all, America is used to the role of playing the big boss. The problem is when it plays the same type of role in Asia, then these countries are different from what you are used to. And probably there will have to be a shift in the American style of actually evoking cooperation. And I think that would require a certain amount of political, you can say, persuasion, because down below, there will always be resistance. And I think if the political leadership makes up its mind of these countries, and I think there is a very strong case for it, and want to give it a form that it wants, and as long as nobody acts as the big boss and everybody got to listen to me, because we don't want to exchange one big boss for another, countries don't like to do that, it would still work. So there is scope. And I think that this is the strongest possible platform, and their time is appropriate. Not because of anything else, because of Chinese continuous strategic behavior.
Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you. I'd now like to turn to Dinakar and ask him to ask his questions.
Yeah, a quick hello everyone, and thank you, Takshashila, firstly. And before, I have a question for General Menon. But before that, just a quick observation. Both made some very, very interesting points. So just to say, there is asymmetry. There's no questioning that. But the point is, you don't have to match tank to tank and rifle to rifle. So when that is the case, say in the last 5 years, there's been since 2012 to be more specific. There's been significant movement on the border, especially in the northern frontier. I mean, either either the case of infrastructure, rotating the men, material, troops, machines, everything. I mean, I had a chance to witness some of them. So there's been a sea change. So it's, while asymmetry exists, it's not, the comparison of trying to, watching too much of videos put out by Global Times is not a good metric for comparison. And that said, on the maritime domain, I mean, Bryan mentioned about Quad and the other formats. Well, Quad definitely is coming out of the, the shadows. One interesting thing is India's engagement with all the Quad countries on a bilateral basis has seen a huge improvement, especially in the last, again, 5 to 7 years. Huge, I mean, significant, quite significant. While India was reluctant multilaterally, it kept on actually pushing the bilateral engagement forward. And now that actually has laid the foundation for the multilateral cooperation. Because, for instance, the last logistics agreement with Japan early this month ensures all the three are in place now, beginning with the US in 2016. And now a maritime information agreement is also in the works with the US. And it already has one with Japan and Australia. And now it has signed the foundational agreements minus BECA, which probably should happen in time soon now. 2+2, hopefully, but if not in the near future. And increasingly common platform, military platforms bought from the US, which the others already operate. So that actually creates the institutional capacities for common operations when required. They may not be doing, but when required, they can do. So, but while maritime is interesting, given the flavor of the season, I'll come back to land borders now, because that's where the next few months the action will be. So that's where I go to General Menon. So again, just to kind of bring an overview on how you match the Chinese build-up. I'm not, that, as I said, you can't do it brick by brick. You don't have to do it, as you also mentioned in your comments earlier. So how do you match it? I mean, there is asymmetry, but how do you match it asymmetrically? How can India do, balance it out on the northern borders?
In 2012, I was a co-author of a document called Nonalignment 2.0. Of course, the word actually sounds to be a bad word these days, and nobody bothered about 2.0, which was not the non-alignment movement at all. But anyway, be that as it may, but in that document, we had visualized that the best way deal with China on the northern borders is to actually improve and extend your options for what we call a quid pro quo. Because there is no way that the Chinese nor the Indians can occupy every inch of that vast mountainous stretch. And therefore, there are opportunities for both countries to do what the Chinese have been doing for quite some time. In fact, actually is what India calls its territory, but now when the Chinese claim line changes, they might have a different view, is the manner in which it has to be dealt with. We don't have to match tank for tank. In fact, this idea of tanks in Ladakh is a very interesting one. It is good for the media to actually talk about tank battles in the high mountains and so on. It's got what I told you, photogenicity to actually impress. But tanks can be used they can be used in very few places, but their survival against anti-tank weapons and air power in an area without any cover is highly questionable. Two, after the tanks does what it has, you need infantry to capture the heights and sit there to protect the tanks which can't climb up those hills. So purely look from a tactical point of view, tanks are meant to frighten. They are meant to tell us about the mechanized divisions that the Chinese have actually mobilized. I'm not saying they cannot be used at all, but they have their limited utility. And therefore, we don't have to match. We have got terrain with us. The advantage that they have, and especially in Depsang, is where the terrain actually gives them a little bit of advantage in terms of the plains which they can actually roll onto. But what happens after that? After that, they have to move forward and capture the hills around it. And that's not going to be easy. And in my calculation, the Chinese don't have the infantry wherewithal to actually go and capture these heights and sit there like we have. And our infantrymen are quite tuned to this job. And I think, therefore, the idea that China is trying to frighten us by mobilizing its theater reserves, telling the whole world that what it's done, can be easily seen through. And there has been now a sufficient time for us to do what we had to. So in terms of, purely in terms of military power and its locations in Ladakh, I think I mean, it's not something which there is any question of a walkover. The Chinese keep reminding us of 1962. We are too strong. You cannot fight us. Okay, yeah. The problem is that they keep to be listening to their own stories and believing it. We don't. And so I think what India did on the night of 29th, 30th August was definitely a proactive move, which has sent the correct message to the Chinese, because it is only after that that at least a joint statement came out of the foreign ministers' meeting. Till then, the Chinese were going solo. So one thing which India actually needs to learn and tell itself constantly, that this guy is strong, but we are no pushover. And I think one of the problems in civil-military relations in India is that the politicians need to be constantly reminded that after all, India's military power, despite all those deficiencies, and you know, in a democratic system, your deficiencies are more advertised than otherwise. And to believe that the Chinese don't have any would really actually not understanding how armies function. And very fact that you can actually carry out a large-scale war in the high altitude Himalayas, sustain it, would actually don't understand between what the main enemy there is, which is the weather, the temperature. And it's not going to be easy. So we are here seeing a situation where India has had enough time. We've got a lot of things to do, especially in terms of infrastructure. There is no doubt about it. That is given. And we've been at it for quite some time. But there, I think maybe India acts best in a crisis. I mean, that's what the normal belief is. And maybe we should thank the Chinese for actually spurring us on to speed up what we should have done before. And I think that's going to happen.
Thank you, General Menon. I'd like to ask Yusuf to ask his question, as we are 20 minutes away from the end of this panel. Yusuf?
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Pande, and thank you, General Menon and Bryan, for your comments. I have a couple of points. One, since Quad is the primary grouping for this region, and since we've already touched about it, my point is that China uses its economic strength, then comes up with projects like the Belt and Road for its strategic gains. So if any grouping in this region that has to come up, especially the Quad being the most prominent one, it will have to have an economic agenda, an economic plan, because there are certain genuine development needs of the region, aspirations of the region. And if those are not met, then it gives these countries an incentive to partner with China, and at the terms the Chinese put up, which helps obviously the Chinese. Apart from that, even incentivizing democracy, I would say, because China works well with authoritarian regimes, because to push its BRI, it's easy for it to deal with strongmen who can, come up with unilateral projects, which are not even economically viable. Something we actually saw in Sri Lanka. So there has to be an economic plan, which is then backed up by the military to safeguard those the economic plan. And my second point is on the military threat itself of China, which is actually indulging in gray zone warfare, the salami slicing, which General Menon talked about. Obviously, its goal is to win without fighting. And we see this in South China Sea, where it's militarized the islands, and also in Ladakh, as it's going on right now. And the massive military modernization, which General also talked about, is probably maybe is part of its war, blitz around the world, showing off its aircraft carriers, its huge warships, so as to it doesn't have to use it to fight it at all. It just scares the region out and submit to its will. So if there is no absence, if there is an absence of any military response, how will this deter China from doing this again? I mean, we saw this on the Pakistan front as far as India is concerned, which used the terrorism backed by its nuclear blackmail to keep on till India then conducted the Balakot strike, and earlier the surgical strike. So there was some cost imposed on Pakistan. What kind of cost can be imposed on China militarily or just short of war, so that it's deterred from undertaking such salami slicing in the future? Thank you.
Bryan and General Menon, I'd like you to answer, but before you do that, since I have exactly about 15 minutes left before, I just like to tag on one question each, so both of you can then give your final remarks. And that was, we've got a lot of questions, and some of the questions, the string of polls, I know both of you have answered, but if either of you wants to talk about that. Second is, there have been people asking about if there's any role that Russia can play, or the Russia-India relationship in sort of, can India or sort of, wean Russia away from China. And the third is, there have been a few questions on, is the US dependable as an ally? And I'm going to throw that out deliberately in a provocative manner. So I will let both of you answer these questions. Thank you. You can go in any order.
Well, I'll go ahead and jump in. Thanks, Aparna. So thank you very much again for the opportunity. So we won't have another chance probably to speak. So thank you to you and to Takshashila for hosting us. So to get to the questions, I do think the U.S. can be a reliable ally. I mean, the U.S. Will come to the aid of its partners and allies that come under a Chinese attack, obviously. But I think with regard to the ability of the U.S. to move and help with contingencies in the Indian Ocean, I think one thing to keep in mind is the U.S.-Japanese relationship. Japan has been modernized its military. What the United States has been trying to do is encourage Japan to improve its ability to defend itself from China, or at least to present a significant enough deterrent of defense to be able to deter China from aggression. That might free up U.S. forces to operate farther abroad. And this is one of the initiatives that's happening within Indo-PACOM, is trying to enable U.S. military forces to deploy farther afield in the Indian Ocean region so that it's not isolated to the Western Pacific alone. And this would allow U.S. forces to come to the aid of India, particularly when it comes to Indian-Chinese naval confrontations that might happen in places like the Bay of Bengal, Andaman Sea, around the Nicobar Islands. So that's something that's been ongoing. And I do think that with that initiative in place, that would give the U.S. more latitude. One concern is Taiwan, and the ability of the Taiwanese to defend themselves has a direct implication for U.S. posture and force deployment. Because even if Taiwan does not put sufficient effort into its own self-defense, if the U.S. is unable to intervene on their behalf, it has significant reputational risk for the United States. So that will sometimes constrain the ability of the U.S. to be able to retain or maintain forces deployed in the Indian Ocean region to support or to bolster the efforts of the Indians to push back on Chinese expansionism. And I agree with the question about the need for a financial or economic component to this, because countries in the region would prefer not to have to do business with China. I guess in a lot of cases, you can see the debt diplomacy being played out right now, and they don't want to go down that road. So it's incumbent upon the Quad to be able to come up with mechanisms to allow these countries to get access to financing, particularly given the availability of money on the financial markets at a relatively low cost today. It would seem a shame to forego that opportunity when trying to kind of press this whole of government strategy for how to counter China. So I think those are some of the considerations that should come into play. But I do think the United States, if it's able to get its long-standing Western Pacific allies to be able to provide enough of a deterrent on their own, it will free up the U.S. to be able to contribute more in the Indian Ocean region.
Thank you, Bryan. General Menon?
Yeah, so I think if I were to understand the question about BRI, it was about how military power can actually play in countering BRI. And I think BRI fundamentally is an economic project, which is, of course, also has got major geopolitical implications, which is actually the real project. So let's be very clear about that. But I wouldn't really would really advise about using military power to actually try and counter the BRI project, because the BRI project actually stretches China through various countries, and it will run against the local frictions which will be there. That itself will create the complications. And I don't think that the Chinese ability to actually do a continental rail system through Eurasia to Europe is going to be a threat to India itself, or to any other countries. I don't see it as a threat. The thing about threaten is, will any of the maritime ports which it is part of, can that be converted for military use? I think that is something which probably, it is not easy to do so. And I would think that if it does, it cannot go unnoticed. So then there would be costs for the countries which are actually making that available. So from my point of view, as far as we are concerned, the CPEC is the closest BRI project that affects us. I'm sure Indian military planners would be already viewing that in terms of what it can do to the CPEC if things get out of control. The second thing is about the role of Russia. And I think that's a very important question, because it's not a state which can be ignored. And how does, especially for India, whose deepened relations with Russia will be challenged. as we shift and make our partnerships deeper based on an Indo-Pacific format. But I think if the Americans can actually change its pressure that it has put on Russia, then Russia really is not a willing partner of China, because China has already intruded into the traditional spaces which Russia has controlled, both in Central Asia and in Siberia. And Russia is very sensitive to it. But it has no choice at this point in time but to actually get closer to the Chinese. But I think there is a reluctance there which they may not express in public. And I was there in Russia last time twice. You could sense it when you have the conversation. They are not comfortable with the idea, because wherever the Chinese have gone, especially in Central Asia, they have an overbearing presence, which not only is disliked by the locals, and certainly is disliked by Russian, which is their natural sphere of influence. So Russia, as far as, will probably play it not to stop any of these partnerships developing, but would probably play a role which would be more standoff than involved and take a side as far as China is concerned. And as far as the US as a dependable ally, this is a major question for Indians, actually. Kautilya and Arthasastra actually put allies very low down in terms of what you can depend on, because they are, he takes the view that they are fundamentally undependable. That's the fundamental basis. But that doesn't mean that depending upon the context, don't actually have allies. Of course, the word ally in India is a political bad word, expletive, because it has connotations from history which cannot easily be wished away. So no Indian politician would actually be like to be called an ally of the US or ally of anybody, but that's part of the political discourse. But there's nothing stopping us from cooperating in any manner, as long as your decisions are not taken against us, because your interest matters more. And I think there is a principle involved here that if you want to have friendship, you'll have to keep that into consideration. What we fear, what the Indians really have as an experience, and especially in recent times with Pakistan, is this issue, that when it comes to issues which matter to you, we may not even be in consideration. And will it be only when you become an ally that we will be in consideration? Or even after we become an ally, will it be in consideration? This is a lingering doubt which US will have to deal with. It can't be wished away. But this is no showstopper anymore, because the Chinese has now made those obstacles more easier to overcome. That's the change in the geopolitical landscape of Asia.
Thank you so much, General Menon and Bryan. We actually managed to do a good job, and I have about 5 or 7 minutes left. So I will therefore sort of, pretend I didn't say what I said earlier, and I will throw one final question to both of you. And that has to do with something both of you said. So there's been a lot of questions asking people about what the end game in Ladakh is going to be. And so I'm going to ask both of you to put your, to bring out your crystal balls, and especially since General Menon actually served in Kashmir, and say, people are asking what will happen. Is there going to be a war? Is sort of, are both sides just going to send troops or not send troops, send missiles there, send bombers there, and they're just going to sit there? Or do you see, and will it continue till next year, for the next year? Or what do both of you see as the end game on the Himalayan borders, not the maritime domain? Sorry, I'm putting you on the spot.
Yeah. So I think I'll go first, Bryan, if you don't mind. the issue which we have to actually ask ourselves is why did the Chinese do what they did? I mean, that question will actually be able to answer. And I think it is pressure which they want to exert on India. And I'm afraid that they have got a lesson from what happened in Doklam. Although India stopped them from building a road, subsequently Chinese militarily occupied Doklam. India acquiesced to that, kept silent on it, although it's a party to that dispute, went through Wuhan and Mamallapuram. And the Chinese probably got the message that India can be pressured. And I wrote at that time that because of this, they are going to actually do something to us later. And it has happened. And I'm not an astrologer. So the Chinese, but this time, and I think Galwan is where actually the game changer is. And I'm not very sure how it happened, but the very fact that something like an incident of that nature took place has changed the political discourse in India, the belief systems in India. And I think Indian leadership is disabused of the idea that we can trust China anymore. I don't think there's any space for trust here. And if we had to look at Chinese intentions, it has nothing to do with the DSDBO road or anything. It's about putting India under pressure. And it is about India, because India has got that capacity of shifting its weight and spoiling the Chinese game. That capacity is what the Chinese are most worried about. It's not about India as a military threat to China, but India can actually shift its weight in a manner that can delay or stump what China's dreams are. And that is what worries China. And therefore, it uses the northern border for that purpose. And we can expect that this particular situation will continue, definitely over winter, probably for quite some time, because one of the things China wants to do is to make sure that India's economy now, especially is devastated by COVID, will have to throw a lot of resources into the northern border. It keeps resources away from becoming a maritime power. Eventually, that is the game that China has been playing for quite some time. And India's challenge is, how does it make sure that it can still protect its border and yet become a maritime power? And one of the things which I have been suggesting for a very long time is we need to rebalance from the West against Pakistan, which is an obsession which we need to get rid of, balance the forces towards the North and free ourselves of resources to become a maritime power. Because finally, in India, that is a lead power or a great power, will have to be a maritime power of some consequence. That is not in doubt.
Thank you, General. Bryan, you get the last remarks.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Aparna. I agree completely with General Menon's remarks. I'll say a couple other things is that one of the perceptions here in the US has been that China has been under pressure from multiple fronts, with Hong Kong, with Taiwan, the recent election, with Japan with regard to the Senkakus and other territorial disputes, and also in the South China Sea, as the US has started to mount more freedom of navigation operations. So the perception was that China was under pressure on a lot of fronts to the east and wanted to avoid India taking advantage of that opportunity to present pressure from the West. And so saw this as an opportunity to create some friction, some ambiguity that would keep India from trying to exploit China's focus on its Eastern challenges. So China, I think, is going to continue to try to maintain that ambiguity and friction in the region as an effort to keep, as the general said, India from being able to consolidate those gains and exploit them for the purpose of taking advantage of China's current condition, which is beset upon by the trade disputes with the US. This semiconductor export control issue is going to become a real problem as Huawei's profits start to really decline. That's one of their national champions. And Hong Kong continues to be a festering problem. And then Taiwan has the potential for becoming an emerging challenge that they're going to have to address. So they're still going to face all those, and they're going to want the India Western front to be something that they have, if not the upper hand in, enough of a frozen conflict that it prevents India from taking advantage of China and what they perceive as a delicate position. I do think that's the likely outcome. It's going to be this ambiguity for some period of time now.
Thank you so much. I'd now like to thank General Menon and Bryan for an excellent discussion. Also like to thank Shibani, Dinakar, and Yusuf, and all of you who have attended it. There's going to be another deep webinar next week. So I hope all of you will attend it. Thank you so much on behalf of Hudson and Takshashila.